This is a CRT, a really, really small CRT. It's functionally the same thing that nerds are using to play Melee on their GameCubes, still to this day. Looking at this thing, you might start to think to yourself that it's remarkably Game Boy shaped. And in this project, I plan to take full advantage of that. My idea is to somehow use this tiny CRT to create a very cursed handheld Nintendo Entertainment System. I won't exactly be able to cram an entire NES into a shell with this thing, and my NES doesn't need to die for this project, so I have ways around this issue. The first stipulation I have for this project is that I want it to take original, full-sized NES cartridges. This requirement is going to cost me a lot of extra work, but I really want to get the true, full Game Boy-like experience out of this thing. I also want to run this thing off of rechargeable batteries. Specifically, I'll be using 18 650 cells, which I can run in series to get the 12 volts I'll need to run the CRT screen. So instead of gutting my perfectly good NES, I'll be cannibalizing this Retron 1 AV. It's a clone NES, but it takes actual NES cartridges rather than coming preloaded with a bunch of ROM files, like so many other clone consoles. It's a completely reverse engineered NES, so there's no software emulation used with this thing. A major advantage to using one of these clone consoles is that they've shrunk down all of the ICs to fit in a single chip on a relatively tiny motherboard, making it perfect for this project. Under this black blob of plastic is the entire functional NES clone. On the other side, we've got the cartridge connector. These are the only parts of the console that I'll need. This is where the real work begins. I've got to desolder the power delivery and controller connector board from the main board of the console, since we won't be needing any of that. I'll just apply some flux and get to work with my soldering iron. Now that we've got the motherboard detached from the rest of the console, we need to remove the cartridge connectors so that we can reattach it in a way where it'll fit flush and parallel with the back of the CRT. This process was extremely tedious, and as I found out, the pads that the connector are soldered to are very cheap and very fragile. If I'm not careful and my soldering wick ends up soldered to one of these pads, it'll be super easy to rip a pad off of the board. I really don't want to have to do any rework on the traces or the pads on this thing. And of course, this is where I ran into my first major hang-up. My soldering wick unknowingly ended up soldered to one of the pads, and it easily tore off the pad as I lifted the wick. We're going to have to fix this, and I'm warning you, it isn't going to be pretty. After a good hour or so of fumbling about, I had the very bright idea to remove some of the PCB solder mask on the trace going to where the pad used to be. I inserted a small piece of copper wire into the hole with the missing pad, which would act as a sort of pin for me to solder a wire to. I then soldered the other end of the wire to the copper of the exposed trace, so I'd hopefully have a continuous electrical connection from the cartridge connector to the blob chip. The next fun step, and luckily the last extremely tedious step of the project, was to reattach the cartridge connector that I had just painstakingly removed from the board. I had to reattach the connector with 60 individual wires. The original NES actually had 72 pins, but at least in the case of this clone console, only 60 pins are actually used. This is probably because some pins on the original NES are reserved for some theoretical expansion options that were never utilized. Some of the pins on the Famicom, which is the Japanese variant of the console, use these pins for expanded audio functions in certain games. For good measure, I reinforced the wire I used to rework the pad and trace with some hot glue. This was mostly to give me peace of mind, since I hadn't even tested the console to make sure it worked, even before I absolutely desecrated it. Now it's time to get that 72-pin cartridge connector attached to the main board again. The tedious part was almost over. Again, I ran into another issue, caused by myself of course. I accidentally skipped a pin on the cartridge connector and shifted all of the wires over by one pin. Not a hard fix, but it was a bit annoying. Not only is it my first time working on a project as complex as this, but it's also my first time trying to film the entire process. I cannot begin to exaggerate how difficult it was to work on this thing while simultaneously focusing on keeping everything in shot and also not filming the back of my head too often, which I definitely did a couple of times. Soldering something that's sitting a full arm's length away from you is really, really hard, and I left this project thinking about how it's probably time for me to see an optometrist. It was now finally time to start working on power delivery for the handheld CRT NES. The clone console takes 5 volts DC, and I'd also be using a speaker amplifier that also took 5 volts. To ensure I wasn't sending a whole 12 volts into both the console and the amp, I'd be using a buck step-down converter to drop the voltage from my theoretical 12 volt battery down to 5 volts. Since the buck converter has variable output, I have to adjust the potentiometer and read the output voltage with a multimeter while I make the adjustment. It's best to do fine adjustments once the converter is hooked up to an actual load, but for now I'm just making sure that I won't be sending too much voltage once I've hooked it up to the console and the amp. Now we can hook up the converter to the console and the amp. I'll be hooking up 2 wires to the converter's output for this. It's worth noting that pretty much all of the soldering from here on will just be temporary, and for testing purposes only. I've just got to make sure that all of the circuitry will work before I throw it in a 3D printed shell. For sound, I'll be using this 3-watt 4-ohm speaker. It'll absolutely be more than loud enough for something like this, and I guarantee it'll put the Game Boy's speaker to shame. It's very much overkill, and probably doesn't make any sense to use, but I feel like it's in the spirit of the project. I'm not going for Ferrari type engineering here, I'm going for more Killdozer type design. I'm getting pretty close to being able to do a power on test, or maybe a smoke test. Who knows, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there, but for now I want to get video output hooked up to the CRT. Last up, before I can at least hook everything up to my benchtop power supply, I've got to attach 2 potentiometers to the CRT. One 50K potentiometer for brightness control, and one 1K pot for contrast control. The CRT actually won't even turn on without these variable resistors plugged into the JST connector. Now it was time for that smoke test I was talking about. I powered on my benchtop power supply and crossed my fingers. When I powered on my supply, the CRT screen came to life, but there was no sign of any video signal coming from the NES. I turned off the power and grabbed my multimeter to make sure the NES was getting 5 volts. It was. Adjusting the picture settings on the CRT didn't help, and the fact that there was no sound coming from the speaker likely meant that the console wasn't running, at least not properly. I found that I had accidentally wired up the speaker's power backwards. It was my first lead, but there was likely something else going on. After fixing the speaker, still no dice. While poking around with my multimeter for a while, I finally found the issue.
What?
I also filmed the back of my head for the millionth time.
Just shorted. Little piece of wire. Just kind of bridging in between a couple of these. That was a dead short too.
After finding a short between 2 of the game cartridge connector pins, I tried powering on the console again. This time the screen at least looked different. This was at least a good sign. I was certain that the console was actually running, and the CRT was receiving a video signal. After fiddling around with the vertical and horizontal hold settings on the CRT for a while, I could see an image, but couldn't quite get it to be stable. No matter what I adjusted, I couldn't stop the image from rolling, and I was worried that there was something wrong with my CRT. Luckily for me, I have another one that I know works. It's a slightly different model or revision, but the only real difference is that the JST connectors for the potentiometers and the power and video input are swapped.
Yeah. Damn. That was doomed from the start. Yeah, that's all working. I can't believe it with that awful soldering fix or that trace repair. But yeah, it's super bright.
Now that I'd verified that the circuitry was working, it was time to get started on that battery. First, I'm checking to make sure that I at least have 3 cells with a matching voltage reading. Charging and discharging a battery that has unevenly charged cells can be really dangerous, as you can damage the cells. Lithium battery fires are no joke, and I'm not trying to burn my apartment down. For the battery, I'll be using this totally overkill 60 amp rated BMS, or battery management system. A BMS is a crucial component in a battery, and cells should never be strung together without one. A cell or any number of cells strung together is not a battery without a BMS. The BMS does the job of making sure that the cells keep an even charge, while also making sure that they don't overcharge or over-discharge. It's also important to note that a BMS is not a charger, and you should never plug a battery into a power supply without a proper charger. The BMS does not regulate how much current or voltage is going into the battery, and it only acts as a failsafe when a cell is over or undercharged. After a quick hot glue job, it's time to create the battery. Each 18650 cell has a maximum current of 4.2 volts, and when strung together in series with the BMS, we get a total of 12.6 volts of output. I'll be using a spot welder to attach the cells to the BMS and to each other. You should never use a soldering iron for this job, as continuous heat from the iron can damage the internal cell structure, leading to decreased efficiency or even complete catastrophic failure of the cell, which means smoke and uncontrollable fire. A spot welder only creates heat for a fraction of a second, which quickly dissipates and won't damage the cells. It looks like we're getting the expected voltage from the battery, so it's time to get it hooked up to the rest of the circuitry. Now we've got the battery hooked up as well as a latching power switch button. It's time for another smoke test.
Here we go. Press the button, and hopefully we should hear sound and get a picture. There's sound, and yeah, CRT turned on. Okay, that's good. I have created such a mess.
So now the CRT NES is finally running off of battery power, but we've still got another issue to solve.
Yeah, so here's an issue I had. With a like a prototype that I made a little while ago.
I ran into a strange issue where when I turn the volume of the console all the way up, the picture on the CRT flickers and distorts. My gut tells me this is caused by a drop in voltage going to the screen, and I think I can solve this by using a boost converter to ensure that the CRT is always receiving 12 volts. The boost converter works like the buck converter, but in reverse. Whenever the voltage drops below 12 volts, it will boost the voltage back up to 12 volts, ensuring that the CRT is always getting the input voltage it needs. It also should have the added benefit of boosting the voltage once the battery depletes to a point where it can no longer provide 12 volts. The BMS will then ensure that the battery completely cuts output voltage once it drops even further.
So we got sound, we got picture. The the step up converter has not exploded. I've had like 3 of those burst into flames. I kind of wish I was filming. It was cool. Okay. There we go. My camera actually adjusted this time. Good job, camera. Synced up to the screen perfectly. It's... well, yeah, 30... okay. Yeah, that's fine. But yeah, volume all the way up, down. No issue.
Up until this point, I haven't really shown any work I had done on the shell that I designed for my project. I designed the shell over the course of a few weeks, working on and off in Autodesk Fusion 360. 3D printing the shell took many tries, and probably hundreds of hours of printing time, as I'm using a pretty entry-level printer that would fail pretty often, and needed to be babysat for much of the process. But now I've got the shell all printed out, and it's time to start figuring out how to sandwich this thing all together. To ensure the two halves of the shell screw together, and to make the shell a little more durable, I'm using heat set inserts. Doing this part was also pretty nerve-wracking, as a mistake here meant waiting another roughly 14 hours to print the front face shell again. Luckily, this went on without a hitch, and I was pretty happy with the result. With everything soldered back together, it was time for one final smoke test.
Alright, time to see if I blew anything up. We're arming it. And it lives.
Now it was just time to screw and glue everything into place. And it's finally finished. Before I go into showing glory shots of the finished project, I need to mention something really important. When I designed this thing, I didn't incorporate any kind of internal charger for the battery. If I were to plug this thing directly into any kind of barrel jack wall connector, it'd almost certainly blow the battery up. Lithium-ion batteries need to be charged using CCCV method, or constant current, constant voltage. This means that when a lithium-ion battery begins charging, a CCCV charger will start providing a constant current to the battery, while slowly increasing the voltage as the cells charge. Once all of the cells reach their maximum operating voltage, the charger will then switch to providing a constant voltage, while slowly dropping the current until the battery is stable and fully charged. An AC to DC wall adapter power supply absolutely does not do this, and using a power supply rather than a proper charger will almost certainly damage itself, the battery, or likely both. Please do not build your own battery and attempt to charge it without a proper CCCV charger. As for final thoughts on this project, I'm very, very happy with the results. This thing is an absolute monster, and the recordings of the screen absolutely do not do it justice. It's bright, fairly crisp, and while black and white, it's a massive upgrade over something like the Game Boy or Sega Game Gear screen. The handheld CRT NES is massive, unwieldy, and frankly hilarious in idea and execution. It's something I can not only look back on as a major personal accomplishment, but also something I'll for sure be able to look back on and laugh at. Most importantly, though, is that I learned a hell of a lot while working on this thing. It was my first time working on something like this while planning and designing everything on my own, and it forced me to learn a lot as I go. I made mistakes and maybe took a couple of risks as I worked on this thing, but now that it's done, I can't help but be proud. Now that the CRT NES is finally done, it's time to move on to the next project. I have no idea what that's going to look like, and I've got nothing in the works, but I'm sure I'll find something. If you've made it this far in the video, I'd like to offer you my most sincere thanks for coming along on this journey with me. I'd also like to thank James of James Channel for making his wonderful and horrifying CRT Game Boy video, which is what inspired me to start this project. I really recommend checking out that video and his channel. There's some really great and more than often unhinged projects that he posts on there. And with that, I guess it's goodbye for now. Stay safe, stay healthy, and make stuff, I guess.